My name is Malcolm Levy. I'm one of the founders of Refraction. We're really, really excited for this talk right now with Hans Ulrich and Ania and Dejha. We've been working really hard trying to envision a conversation like this, and I just wanted to point out the incredible work by Operator here. It really speaks to a lot that I think they'll get into. And without further ado, welcome.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here, and it is a real pleasure and privilege to be in conversation here with the amazing art of Operator, and we should give them a big round of applause and a very warm welcome. I also wanted to say a few thank yous. Of course, thank you to Refraction, and thank you, of course, to Tezos. Bettina Korek, our CEO, who is here. A big round of applause for Bettina. And we also welcome here Nicolas Smirnov, a very warm welcome. Nicolas Smirnov. I'm very grateful to Tezos, the co-founders Arthur and Kathleen Breitman, to Valerie Whitaker, and also to Vincian Jones for this amazing collaboration. We always say Serpentine and Tezos is 1 + 1 = 11, but today we have to say Serpentine and Tezos and fraction is 1 + 1 + 1 = 111. So we had a great meeting with both of you actually in London the other day with Björk, and Björk was also both Björk and I were very impressed by your work, and just following up on this conversation, I kind of wanted to begin with the beginning and ask you how it all began. Was there an epiphany at the beginning? How did it begin?
Well, no one really believes this, but we met on Instagram. And for anyone who knows about our practice, it mostly deals with surveillance capitalism and extractive technology, so this comes as a shock. But yes, we met to work together, to collaborate in LA in 2015, and then
2016.
Oh no! Okay, here's the marital bickering. Here we go. And so then what happened?
Well, it started off as a meeting to discuss collaborating together, and I like to say that the first half was a meeting and the second half was a date. And then basically that first meeting we were talking about working together, so naturally we were talking about artists we love. Oh, have you read this book? Have you seen this film? Oh, you need to see this performance. So actually from the very beginning of literally the first time we were sitting at a table together, we were already sharing references of things that we wanted the other one to experience. So I kind of feel like while we didn't start working together until much later, later that year, which is really fast for lesbian time. But art was really at the very beginning of our relationship at the center, I would say.
And so we found ourselves with a 7-year collaborative art practice, a marriage, and a cat named Claude.
And actually, it was interesting because you have very different backgrounds, no? And we spoke about that in London. It would be great to hear a bit, because Ania, you have a background in choreography and performance art, and Dejha, your background is in human-computer interaction and also immersive art. So I was curious maybe to hear a little bit about these two very different backgrounds, and also who inspires you. And it's less in the sense of a genealogy, because there's this great book by Alexis Pauling-Gams on Sylvia Wynter. It's called W. It's for DAB, for Sylvia Wynter's W. And Alexis Pauling-Gams says that it's not that she'd be genealogically inspired by Sylvia Wynter, but in a way, Sylvia Wynter is a toolbox. So the question is maybe less genealogically what are your inspirations, but it's more what are your toolboxes, because often the future is somehow invented with fragments from the past. I know Merce Cunningham was important, but there's of course much, much more.
Yes. I like this framing of influence as a toolbox. It feels more accurate than you just, looking at something and being inspired, because also a lot of the people who I feel are in my toolbox and people that I reference or whose processes or whose work I admire aren't actually choreographers or performance artists. They could be filmmakers like Chantal Ackerman, for example, or the life of Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas is definitely like I look to people outside of my medium in addition to obviously in the performance and choreography world, the classics. I mean, Pina Bausch and Teresa de Keersmacher. A lot of performance people, but also writers, filmmakers, equally are in the toolbox, which I like to look at mediums outside of the medium that I'm working in to get inspired, because I feel like if you want to make dance, you should look at architecture. If you want to make music, you should read poetry,
For me, inspiration isn't something you go get, right? It's something that, for me, happens more in a moment of stillness, and it's less external. At the same time, and so when we talk about toolboxes, I think that having that kind of space is what can generate inspiration. But specifically, I loved Brian Eno in my early 20s, and I felt that he was influential because here he is, a musician and a producer, but at the same time, he's an artist in everything he touches. And so it wasn't defined necessarily by a medium. And with a background in multimedia, I was very interested in being medium agnostic. And that's the worst thing you could do in the art world is not stick to one thing, right? But I have a lot of respect for Brian Eno for this. And in addition to that, Mark Weiser, who is a computer scientist who coined the term calm technology as well as ubiquitous computing.
It's great to hear that because, Brian Eno is a very close friend of the Serpentine. He lives near, actually, the Serpentine. He's almost our neighbor. And our whole, Back to Earth project, which are these environmental campaigns we're doing with artists, ecological campaigns, it all really started with Brian Eno and with Gustav Metzger. So that's really great to hear. I wanted to ask you also about the name, because it's always interesting, where artist collective kind of names begin. I once spoke to the German, artist group Zero, Günther Uecker, Mark Pine, and they all had different versions about how they found their name. I think one of them said that they just opened a dictionary and then there was like Zero, and then that became the name. So I was wondering if you both have the same version, how you found the name Operator, because you said in an interview recently that very few people ask you where your name originates. So I thought I should ask you that question.
I think at the very beginning it was super practical. It was basically like, okay, our medium is using a lot of technology and women aren't trusted with technology. And our projects take a lot of resources. And women aren't trusted with money. And so we were like, okay, how do we create a container that enables us to create our work that paints this kind of performance of reliability? Instead of being like, Ania and Dejha, we're operator. It's like an entity that sounds like someone would fund a project or trust that we can deliver on what we say we're going to do, because there's a lack of trust. So I felt like we needed a container that performed reliability and trust in what we could do. And even if you look at our kind of visual language for operator, it has invoices and signature lines. It's kind of this fluxus performing the system of being a reliable business that has everything in order as a way to just make our work possible. There's another side.
I was going to say you said it all. Specifically, the fluxus performing the system. I think that's the most important part, right? To infiltrate and perform the system instead of being performative. The other aspect is the history of women and technology. People seem to forget sometimes that women have been there since the beginning. They don't need to be brought in, technology doesn't need to become more inclusive. Women were there from the beginning, and so it's also a call out to, the early computer scientists and operators.
Yeah, it's interesting. I visited the other day, actually a few years ago, Lilian Schwarz, who was of course part of the of the experiments in art and technology with Billy Kluwer. And that was a kind of an interesting initiative, of course, where Kluwer brought together artists with Bell Laboratories, the leading tech company of that time, and the artists could sort of have labs, collaborating with them. So I was kind of wondering about that. Do you think we need kind of new experiments in art and technology, and do you do such kind of alliances and collaborations with what would be the Bell Laboratories of our times?
Artists working with engineers and working with advanced technologies is very tricky. So even in the case of the experiments in art and technology movement of the 1960s, these were like Cold War engineers. And so also looking at the technologies that are available then to artists, which have very different goals than creativity. They're used for war. Now what we have, and the engineers and the technologies that are created, are mostly for surveillance capitalism. So the artistic tools that artists working with technologies, what we have available to us, and what we always do, is think about who made this, what is the worldview of the person who made this, what was it made for, instead of just being like, this is cool, what can it do, but actually trying to interrogate the why and unpack the kind of silent worldviews that are embedded in the technologies that we use. So with that said, and the EAT movement is very inspirational to us, mainly because it wasn't an engineer asking artists to come do something cool with their technology, and it wasn't an artist having a vision and asking an engineer to bring it to life, but it was instead artists and engineers coming together from ground zero and being like, let's figure shit out and like make something amazing. And what I love about it particularly is that performance was so embedded. I mean, 9 Evenings was basically theater and engineering performances with Yvonne Rainer and Simone Forti and some of the best, performance artists of that time. And so performance was very embedded into the early days of art and technology, particularly the EAT movement. And then at some point they really separated. And so our work now, particularly Human Unreadable, is trying to build that bridge again, but with the technologies of today with a critical lens.
I would add, yes, we need more EAT energy, more Black Mountain College energy, more than ever. And I say that because when we live in a time where pro-innovation bias runs so strong, meaning the idea of liking something, a technology, just because it's new, right? Without asking any questions. Is it generative AI? Is it using blockchain? All of these things. Of course, these are exciting technologies that can be used meaningfully, but we shouldn't just blindly use them just because they're exciting and novel, right? And when you have meaningful collaborations between artist and engineer, truly meaningful, then you're not tempted to just show off the shiny new tech. And so I feel it's more important than ever that these rich collaborations are taking place, and also in order for the artist and engineer to be critical in the technologies that they're creating art with.
As part of this, interview project where I go to interview also pioneers, like Lilian Schwarz, about sort of connections between art and technology. I went last weekend to interview Robert Whitman, who of course was a co-founder of, Experiment in Art and Technology. Lives upstate New York in his late 80s, and we had an amazing conversation on the kind of presence, of the human body and the connection to technology, which you have in some of Whitman's performances, which are also architectural, because he built these amazing architectures, spaces, quite intimate spaces where, these encounters could happen. And this connection kind of between, the human body and technology brings us to one of your most well-known work, which is, of course, Human Unreadable. And with that work, you really, for the first time in such an incredible way, brought choreography to the blockchain, and combined really both of your backgrounds in a way, in a sort of synthetic way. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the epiphany which led to this piece, when you had the idea, how did you have the idea for Human Unreadable? The ideas behind it, and also how you refer to it actually as a generative choreography. Maybe to explain to us what is a generative choreography.
Okay. Sure. Anything, honey? Okay, so where to start? Human Unreadable is and generative choreography and what we set out to do is reflective of, I would say, the limitations as well as the capabilities of both blockchain technology as well as human body technology, okay? And it's the two of these mixed together that create human unreadable. What I mean is, when we created this work, if it wasn't on blockchain, right, then we would have a totally different tool set available to us. And if we didn't need the human body, right, the same is true. This idea came about when we were creating the Privacy Collection, which is a site-specific project that looks at the tension between privacy and privacy and transparency inherent in blockchain technology. And so it's a series of lots that looks at this tension. And one of the lots is human unreadable. And we were looking about the site-specific location being generative art, on-chain generative art. So we thought, how, with the human body as a central aspect to our practice, how do we meaningfully bring the human body into a generative artwork? And when we thought of doing that, we didn't realize that we were going to have to generate a 9-month process just to, create a method in order to get the generative choreography system pipeline working, and before we even got to the visual of what does it look like. I'll let you continue to take the story from there.
Yes, so it was, as Dejha mentioned, generative art as a site that we were creating for. And knowing that we wanted to bring the body, we were like, okay, so, what if instead of an algorithm just generating an image on chain, what if the algorithm was generating a choreographic sequence, which actually has very interesting historical links. If you look at Cunningham's Chance Dance, for example, when he was using dice rolling and saying, okay, if I roll a 2, that means I'm going to spin. If I roll a 6, I'm going to turn. And so it was this interesting link at that moment when we thought about a generative algorithm creating a movement sequence that seems very new because it's on chain, but we're like, actually, it's not new. It's just a new version of chance operations enabled and happening on chain. But I think in human unreadable, we have like a whole hour and a half long talk about it for a reason. It's very dense. But I think from one thing that's really important to me is as a choreographer and performance artist and someone who was working in mediums that were not able to be sold, and the art market has not been able to really deal well with the selling of performance art. And I think particularly in a US context where, major theaters are closing, and the only ways that performing artists and people with kind of body-based practices can support themselves are, leveraging their skills for the entertainment industry because they don't have a thing to sell. And this is also what was the truth of digital artists working for agencies and in advertising before they were able to just tokenize, prove that their work was a unique work that someone could own. And so the idea behind Human Unreadable, beyond the concept behind the site-specific way of bringing the body and blockchain together and like moving generative choreography from the past into its most current version available, is also the idea that choreography is becoming collectible through this project. So every collector, they might have just wanted to mint an artwork on art blocks, but what they ended up doing is owning a choreographic sequence. So now motion data of a choreographic sequence stored on chain becomes a digital asset that someone can own. And so we're hoping that this is kind of the door opening to performance being able to have a pipeline to become collectible in a way other than documentation thereof, which is basically how it's happened so far.
Yeah, which has been always a big question. Yeah, how can it survive beyond kind of the mere archive of it being a documentation? And that's, of course, what happens with this piece. You said, I'm quoting you here from an older interview, because the choreography is on chain in the same way that digital art is, it was able to become collectible in this way. Performers will be performing sequences generated by an algorithm, and viewers are watching on-chain generative art. It's bringing digital art out of the screen and into the body, which is, what you explained now so beautifully. Now, obviously, what it also means is that there is a kind of a thought process about governance, ownership, and you mentioned in another interview that it kind of creates a community of builders, no? That kind of art meets technology. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the community this project builds and how the community evolves and where it stands now in December 23?
Well, currently, so there's 3 acts to Human Unreadable. So first, it was the mint on art blocks, where folks would reveal the output from our P5JS project. And then there's Act 2, which just was released 2 weeks ago, where collectors are able to connect to the operator website and reveal the underlying choreography that created their piece. So this information was always, and data was always available on chain, but we obfuscated the data. And so what people were able to do was reveal the choreography through an on-chain SVG rendered choreographic score that very much looks like, pencil sketches of stick figures. And what happens there is that once the collector reveals, everyone can see it. And in this way, it very much open sources the choreography. So anyone can see it and perform it, right? They could there's 400 pieces in the collection, they could remix them to create their own performance without even ever talking to us. So that was one aspect. And then what's next is Act 3, where we will have a live performance of the first 100 pieces minted.
One thing that is interesting to me about this is while choreography is now owned and collected, it is simultaneously decentralized. So as Dejha mentioned, these scores are available online. So someone, anyone with internet access can go and they can literally put the sequence into their own bodies and they can experience that artwork without owning it, while there still remains only one person who actually owns the sequence, and their ownership is provable, and that can be sold and transferred to someone else. But anyone can basically embody any one of the sequences within Human Unreadable. So it's decentralized and also collected.
And one thing, thank you so much for this answer. And one thing I was also curious about is, Mario Merz once told me that with art, with an artwork, it's very difficult to last. And you have a similar quote, which has been very often quoted. When I was reading previous interviews, it's kind of your most frequently quoted quote, which is, "Tech does not age well, concepts do." And obviously, as you talked before about concepts, behind this piece, I wanted to ask you to explain that quote to us.
Okay, so that quote is part of the operator rules for art and technology that we created in 2019. And, given that Ania and I's practice is very much experiential and very much immersive and uses technology at the core, in addition to the human body, there is the medium itself lends itself to the risk of falling into the tricks and gimmicks of art and technology. And so we created this simple rule set for us to hold ourselves accountable that we wouldn't fall into the tricks and gimmicks of art and technology. And so one of them is say no to tech demos, and there's several, no to spectacle, a la Yvonne Rainer. Don't rely on scale. If the technology is no longer novel, will the work still hold up? Asking questions like this, but finally resulting in the core question of, and the statement that tech doesn't age well, concepts do, right? The idea of not heroing the technology, but heroing the concept, right? Because technology will continue to age, and if it's relying on that aspect, the work won't hold up. But if it's relying on the concept and the technology is serving the concept, then I think we're safe.
Yeah, concept is almost like an anti-aging serum. Like the only kind that I like.
Thank you. So that's another quote to remember. Now, I want to thank also, Kay Watson and our head of technology at art and technology at the Serpentine, and our amazing team who really introduced us to you and your work. And we should give them a big round of applause. And Kay and the team have pointed out to me that, and that goes back, to my toolbox question from before, that in relation to this question, of performance and dance and technology, choreography, you have tweeted about different pioneers, and I wanted to kind of ask you to tell us a little bit more, because I always think it's important, to protest against forgetting and remember such pioneering, inventors of technology and art. And you tweeted about Ana Livia Cordero's generative dance piece, 0 degrees, 45 degrees, version 1 from 74. And you've also tweeted, as Kay and the team pointed out to me, as Jan Beeman and Dale Isner's computational choreography work, Random Dances. It's I don't know from which year this is. And that's, of course, from an exhibition at the ICA in London. It's a very, very famous show called the Serendipity Show. Could you talk about these two toolboxes? Because it somehow connects, I think, what you've just explained.
Yeah, absolutely. So computational choreography, and I think Lillian Schwartz is part of the kind of early phase, because in the earlier days of generative art, I think, similar to what you see now, it's quite disembodied, leaning into like modernist design and geometry, and a lot of the earlier women working in digital art that didn't have the kind of success of their male counterparts. They were trying to infuse generative art in working with the computer, with physicality, with the body, with sensuality, with things that kind of made people feel like, why would you try to merge those two things together? And it's funny when you look, and that show, Cybernetic Serendipity at ICA London in the 60s. So there was a lot of generative art of the time, and Jean Beeman, who did Random Dances, that was a computational choreography project. So it was there at the very beginning, computational choreography. And Ana Livia Cordiero was also a pioneer in kind of choreography and code. So I found it interesting just from a gender perspective that at the beginning there were women that were really trying to do things with the body and technology in ways that weren't really recognized at the time. And I think now, especially with Ana Livia Cordiero's recent exhibition at ZKM, and more, interest in how to merge the body and physical experience. And now everyone's talking about phygital, and but forgetting that we have a body, and the body and technology can interact in interesting ways. So computational choreography has a very rich history we're building on, and those are two of the pioneers, and they're women, and I think that's interesting.
It's actually exactly the same, in my research on video games, which I made for world building, is also an absolute majority of the pioneering artists who worked early on with video games. Think about Rebecca Allen and many more, all women, it's exactly the same. Now, you mentioned this idea of, kind of the digital and the physical and the body. Yesterday, we made a visit actually with Serpentine friends to the studio of Harmony Korine here in Miami. And, Harmony has 2 studios, which is very fascinating. He's got a studio, which is a painting studio, which is completely analog, drawing, painting. And then he's got a studio, which is almost like a kind of a new Warholian factory with tech, where programmers, invent games. And it's like, very related to video games. And what really somehow kept coming back, or we kept returning to this idea in the conversation with Harmony, that the future in a way is not either or, but it's kind of mixed reality, And you have, of course, also moments in your practice where the work has traversed the digital into the physical, kind of mixed reality pieces. I'm thinking, for example, in an early piece, which is called On View, which you did in 2019, where you kind of evolved digital art also beyond spectacle. I think that's another thing which is important in your work, and kind of implicate the viewers to become very physical, active participants. So yeah, maybe we can talk about the future being mixed reality and how you explore it in your work, and maybe we begin with On View and then can talk about some recent works also of yours in relation to mixed reality. Yeah.
So when I think of mixed reality, I really think more about how visible technology doesn't equal high tech. And often when mixed reality conjures up images in my mind, and I think others as well, or in a Google search, will be very visible technology. And this isn't what I imagine for moving forward in the future. And On View references heavily the idea of ubiquitous computing, and also calm technology, but also the issues with ubiquitous computing, right? I mentioned Mark Weiser earlier, the computer scientist who coined the term. And the great thing about ubiquitous computing is that the technology is invisible, right? It falls back into the background and it's indistinguishable from everyday life. But that's also the danger, right? Especially if you're thinking of extractive technologies and surveillance capitalism. So On View was looking at the issues of extractive technology and our engagement with social media and our willingness or inability to not function without giving up our data. And occupying these predatory technology infrastructures. And it was looking at that issue, but also using it technically. So in On View, which is, other than Human Unreadable, one of our most technically challenging artworks, all of the technology was invisible. You were interacting through facial recognition, you were interacting through environmental sensors. There were no digital interfaces. However, you were controlling a virtual world. And so when I think of mixed reality in the future, for me, this is, I think, where it's going, which has a lot of dangers to present and challenges, but also the ability to allow us to be more present if we choose to go in that route and not having technologies nagging us. Did you want to add?
I wanted to add one thing about On View, in which the audience participants' body, I think, sent like very subtly a signal and like registered something. So in the experience of someone asking if you want to update an app and you click this like tiny checkbox, thanks, that says, I agree. That feels like the choreography of agreeing, of just doing this, feels like that can't be that serious. It's just like this little ding. So in On View, we very practically needed to get the audience participants' consent because we were going to be photographing them and doing all this stuff because that was the concept of the piece. So we decided to actually turn the phase of the audience agreeing to be put on view by us in our installation into a part of the artwork. So the first phase of the work was an immersive contract, which was like very well lit, and they actually signed a contract that was written on the wall by standing on like a sensor in the floor, and then this LED light circled, and if the circle continued, drawing from like the IG UI of the story, you know. So anyways, once they did that, then they had agreed. And a lot of people even just were too scared to walk into the room. So it was almost like this, if the agreeing is the choreography of pressing a small thing, it felt like a real commitment for someone to be like, I am putting my body in this circle. I'm agreeing to this, you know, contract that I'm inside of, and I'm feeling how intimidating and how real it is to agree to something. So using the body and also that the innate knowledge that we all have within our bodies, that like this doesn't feel safe, this feels wrong, this feels weird, is something that you can really leverage because our body is a very sophisticated technology. And so using that in our work rather than, you know, showing more screens, but being like, how can your body tell you how you actually feel about the technological infrastructures that we're all inhabiting right now?
Thank you. Now, a more recent work which has also got to do with participation is privacy portraits. That's a work from last year, and the sitter or viewer actually becomes part of the performance. But there is also anonymization, I think that's a word in English, is at stake, no? Because the portrait is actually a visual pseudonym of some sorts. It sort of allows whoever collects it to be represented without actually being exposed. Can you talk a little bit about how this works, the kind of rules of the game of privacy portraits, and how anonymization works in relation to that, which usually is the opposite of portraiture?
Right, and this work, which is also part of the privacy collection, was looking at the site of PFPs and how, you know, what does it look like to hide within a transparent system, right? While still also having agency to navigate these systems and also represent yourself. And so we thought, could we create an experience that uses the same generative mechanisms of a PFP?
A profile picture, for those who don't
picture.
know what a PFP is.
And the way that we did it, though, was not through code, but analog algorithms. So the experience went as such. You would walk in to the exhibit, and you would be invited to walk around the space of portraits, which were projected on transparent materials, which is one of the key featured materiality of the privacy collection. You then were brought through the experience by a guide who would bring you upstairs to the mezzanine where Ania would take your photo. But before she would take your photo, she would ask you a question. She would ask, think of something you prefer to keep private. Okay, and then she took the photo on Polaroid, and then that Polaroid was put into a security box. It was then handed to another performer who brought you into a room where you could roll dice. You would roll dice, and the numbers would be recorded and also put into the security box. You and the performer would walk down to the anonymization desk. The box was given to me, and I would look almost like a deli ticket. You know, when you get a sandwich made. But
I miss deli tickets. I miss like the physical ones.
Yeah. Well, this was a physical deli ticket, except for the recipe was, what tools will I use to anonymize this portrait? So each security box had a timer in it, and I had to unlock it. So I had, which was, I don't know, we didn't really think that through because alarms were just going off because you had to properly wait 15 minutes for the Polaroid to develop.
So chaotic.
And so I would open it up, and I would, see what numbers were there and what they correlated to in terms of materiality, which was fire, chemical, light, glass, different types of manipulation. And I would apply that manipulation based on the numbers that were rolled, and then I would scan the images. Those were scanned, put into the projection mapping system, and also minted live. So they were essentially given a portrait of themselves, but they were fully anonymized. But what's behind that portrait is also what they chose to keep private.
It's fascinating because whenever, I'm in Miami, I'm kind of thinking about my late friend Felix Gonzalez Torres, who, of course, passed away here in Miami, and I kept receiving many postcards from him where he talked about the slow summer mornings in Miami and sent amazing postcards. And Felix, of course, worked with portraiture in such a fascinating way. And I read also about your Proof of People event in London, where you sort of opened actually an operator atelier, and you there also created these portraits. And in a similar way to Felix, even if, of course, the form is very different, you created portraits of collectors. Felix created these portraits of collectors according to dates. Dates which are very, connected to important biographical stations, but which then the viewer can also relate to. And you said about these kind of anonymized portraits of collectors that they're not only, durational performances, but as you just said, that are also chance operations. And that, of course, made me think, not only of Felix, but made me think also of your deep connection to Merce Cunningham and John Cage. So I wanted to ask you about chance. What's the role of chance in your practice?
As a couple, I feel like Cunningham and Cage, along with Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas, are like really up there in terms of couple goals for us.
How are we doing?
Pretty good. Yeah, I think good. What was the question?
Gents.
Oh, right. Okay. So we had an interesting conversation actually yesterday. And this question was asked recently because we are very detail-oriented, like no stone left unturned when it comes to anything that we are working on in terms of production or questions or reasons why. So I do feel like actually to set up a generative system or to engage with chance actually requires a lot of control. Like I imagine like working on human unreadable, and like in the end, the algorithm is going to create the image and the algorithm is going to create the sequences. But we did so months of outputs to fine tune, and I did tuning rehearsals where we would run the model. I'd have dancers perform the sequences as they were spit out and be like, no, there's too many movements while they're on the floor. So I feel like chance kind of has this stereotype of being like loose and fun, but actually to set up systems in which chance creates interesting results that you actually want to say, yes, this is my art, I made it, requires so much control and so much time and so much decision making, or else you might have something that comes out that you're not proud of. And because we want to be proud of anything that we make, there's actually a lot of control in setting up chance.
I would just add, it's this interplay between control and submitting. And there's that moment with control where you're setting up the emergent system. What is the rule set? And that can, what are the principles in this game or in this system, right? That will generate, unexpected outcomes that are beyond what I can think of, beyond what I could create without these systems that I'm developing. But then you have that control aspect, and then you have the submitting. And going back to Brian Eno, your neighbor, he said something in an interview, I think in 2012, during the Red Bull Music Academy. I think this is when the interview was. He talked about how in society we really value the moments of control where, if a surfer is, catching a wave, that ability to, finally catch the wave at the right moment. But then we don't value the submitting, right? Where we just have to ride the wave. But it's equally as important. And I feel that the chance aspect is that submission, is that ability to submit to that moment that is complementary to the aspect of control in the same process.
Now, another question I wanted to ask you is, of course, because this kind of is also connected to the portraits, it's, of course, the signature. And the question of the signature is a recurrent question in your work. In a way, the question actually, is the signature the artwork or vice versa? And you did a work actually in 2022 called Unsigned, and that's a dialogue you had with our friend Annika Meyer, who once told me about this work. It's a collection of, I think 100 signatures, is that correct? 100 signatures from women and also non-binary artists. Can you tell us about that work and, how you collected these signatures and also what it means in relation to authorship?
So in August of 2022, there was an article that came out in The Guardian and kind of this finding that was getting a lot of attention by a researcher named Helen Gorel, and she's an art historian. And she, in her finding in a book, Woman Can't Paint, was that when a woman signs their artwork, the value goes down, and when a man signs their artwork, the value goes up. So essentially, an artwork that's signed by a woman is worth less than that same artwork without a signature on it because it's attributing female authorship, and so that actually makes it less valuable. So this is true to the point that often women artists are asked to leave their work unsigned to protect the value. And this is just gross. I mean, come on, it's just gross. So we were actually at a dinner, and we were all discussing this, and it was like we were all sitting there at a Tezos dinner in Berlin, and we were like, we were like sitting there with Annika, and we're like, we should just sell the signatures, because if we can prove that the signatures have a positive value by turning them into a digital asset, then by default, if that signature is applied to a work, if the signature alone is worth this amount of money, then that person's artwork with the signature would then, make that artwork more expensive. So almost a conceptual and literal undoing of the negative valuation of the signature through proving its value on the market as a digital asset, NFT. So that's exactly what we did. And the next day, me, Dejha, Annika, and our friend Evelyn Benchachova minted the first 4 signatures from the collection, and they all sold immediately. And then for the next 2 months, we released, I think, 12 per week. So it's a full collection of 100 women and non-binary artist signatures. And they all sold out, and now I think the cheapest signature is around like $2,000. So the signatures that once had a negative value, now most people can't even afford to own a signature that used to be worth negative money. So it was a conceptual, and also collaborating with the market and crypto culture and speculating, because now the signatures are a hot commodity. So it's great, let's leverage that momentum for something good and to raise more awareness of how far we have not come when it comes to women and in the art world.
such an important project. And another very important project is, of course, and that goes from signature then to certificate, is the marriage certificate. I just was in the studio of Tommaso Binga, the poet, legendary poet in Rome, who actually also made in the 70s a marriage certificate as an artwork. I'm going to show you the image later on. I didn't know about this until then. And I wanted to ask you to tell us about that, because it is actually a very complex work. It is your marriage certificate, minted as an NFT, but within that there is another contract. So it's almost like a contract. If I understand well, there is a contract within the contract, and that second smart contract is entitled Marital Obligations, and there is a kind of an on-chain transcript of your marriage certificate written in text, which of course you can update at any time. Can you tell us about that project?
Sure. Ania and I are married, legally. Everyone always asks, well, legally, are you married? That's an interesting thing. Anyway, so yes, legally, we are married. We have a piece called Let Me Check with a Wife. Okay, and we thought two things. It would be interesting. People are like, why would you get married? It's a very old school thing to do. But the idea of queering the container of marriage is something that's interesting to us, right? Performing the system, right? We go back to the Fluxus performance art mindset. Also, it's very interesting when you're sitting in a meeting with a man, potentially, or many men, and they're talking about the plans for the weekend, and they have to say, let me check with the wife, and then I can say that too, and it throws everyone off. Is another thing. But the work also comments on the fact that there are over 1,000 rights that you get as a U.S. citizen if you are married. Rights that we wouldn't have if we weren't married. And it's just not too long ago that marriage between two women, or same-sex marriages, are even legal, right, or recognized. And
I think we were within the first 10 years of it being legal in the United States to get married.
Right. So that includes if I'm in the hospital and you needed to visit me, we couldn't do that without being married, right? There's some practical things there. So we were looking at that. But to speak to this secondary contract that you're talking about, so we minted this piece on Super Rare, which you get both the physical marriage certificate and you also get the scan of it as well. And then we created a secondary NFT called Marital Obligations, which we wrote on our own smart contract, our own Solidity contract, and we use something called the owner of function. And what that does is it can tie one token to another token, right? And so that whoever owns Let Me Check with the Wife also gets this thing called marital obligations, right? And it just follows you around, So, you can't get rid of it. Well, if you get rid of, if you sell it, to Eleonora over there, then she has the marital obligations, right? And so
she doesn't want it. She's lived with us.
and so it's this thing that can't be separated, right? So conceptually, we get what's happening there. But the thing about it is that it's a dynamic NFT, and our anniversary is July 19th. And so every year on our anniversary, the collector has an update. And it's about their marital obligations, because now that they're part of our marriage, they have also marital obligations. It's not just us. But why did we do this? Well, we were fascinated by this idea of utility in crypto art culture, where the artist is somehow expected to, create a work and then continue to provide services, like we're an agency, and having to provide client services. And we thought this was very strange. And so we thought, well, let's build in reverse utility, where the collector has to provide utility to us.
Yeah, this is so brilliant. And I think and it's again a connection to Felix Gonzalez Torres, because with, Let Me Check with the Wife in 2022 in this project, you basically, it's an interesting text by Gretchen Andrew, who wrote on a text on NFT and smart contract. And in this text, Gretchen Andrew actually describes this idea that the collector, has to give something or promise something to you every year on the anniversary. So this idea that actually, when a collector buys an artwork, it's only the beginning, and then an effort needs to be made. I mean, Felix even compared it to me once in an interview. It's almost like also if somebody wouldn't water a plant, the plant wouldn't be there anymore. So you have an obligation, no, in a way, with an artwork. And Felix had similar kind of contracts. So I think it's interesting. Is Felix important for you as an artist?
I can't believe that you brought him up because he wasn't in our prep notes, but last night I was going to sleep and I was thinking about Felix Gonzalez Torres and the billboards of the empty sheets that he did, which is, like, in my book, one of the best artworks in the world, one that just sticks with me forever. And for some reason, when we were thinking about Let Me Check with the Wife, that artwork came up because, so this was created for, this all connects, I swear, somewhere. This was created for a Pride exhibition. So it was, celebrating queer artists. And I think people were very surprised when they saw a government document in a queer art show, and it's because there's kind of, in the same way that there's an expected aesthetic of digital art, there's also an expected aesthetic of queer art. Like, what does it look like? We recently were proposed for a fashion brand who wanted to do something during Pride. Gay people get so much love in the month of May. Oh my God, it's so annoying. It's like, where are you the other 11 months? But anyway, the fashion brand said that our work wasn't gay enough. And so what I mean by this is when a brand needs to virtue signal how inclusive they are, the artwork needs to be, like, obviously gay, and appear to be gay because that helps them prove how open they are. And so work like Felix Gonzalez Torres and the sheets, which is, commenting on the empty beds of, like, the gay men who died during the AIDS crisis, and the subtlety of how the AIDS crisis actually affected the view of someone who wakes up to a bed where their partner is no longer there, and putting that moment on view, the kind of everydayness of queer life, the kind of quiet, mundane ways that, like, two women who live together try to function or visit each other in a hospital. Like, these are moments of queer identity that a fashion brand is not interested in because it's not helpful, for them to perform their inclusivity. And so thinking about Let Me Check with the Wife, it did remind me of this billboard because we very intentionally, very strategically, were like, we want to show a more intimate, mundane, everyday exploration of queer identity as it's lived, not as it's performed, and also particularly not how it's leveraged for other people's interests who are very disconnected from the daily lived experience.
And again, it's so fascinating in relation to Felix, because I was once with him in a cafe, in a restaurant, and we were talking about art, and he all of a sudden took his passport and put it on the table. Obviously, there are also these amazing pieces with passport, which are also, in that sense, administrative documents and certificates, right? And he threw the passport on the table, and he said, in all his galleries, he sees art about representation of the body, and he says, when we don't need necessarily casts of bodies or photographs, and he threw the passport on the table, and he said, this is as much about the body, Yes. So again, the link to Felix. One thing I wanted to ask you towards the end of this conversation is really, because you've realized so many groundbreaking projects, and we are extremely fortunate and lucky to hear you speak about these projects here today. But I think it's always interesting to hear also about projects which haven't, happened yet. And as many of you know, I'm particularly interested in unrealized projects, and that has to do with Alighiero Boetti, who a long time ago when I met him said, it's so strange, artists are always asked to do things, in galleries and museums and, biennales and art fairs, but sometimes they have projects completely elsewhere, completely different projects which not necessarily fit in any of these boxes, and nobody really ever asks about that. And it's interesting that we know a lot about architects' unrealized projects, because obviously architects publish the unrealized projects because in the architecture world you have competitions, and then even the competition entries which are not realized are usually being published. And as Zaha Hadid always told me, very often reality gets then produced through that, because unrealized architecture projects are published, and then a few years later people realize these could actually be built, no? Whilst actually, strangely, we know almost nothing, as Boetti said, about artists' unrealized projects. There is a kind of a total sort of ignorance about that. And of course, the range of unrealized projects is pretty wide. I mean, there are projects which can be too big to be realized. There can be projects which are too time intense to be realized. I met Friederike Mayrock, the Austrian poet, when she was 97 years old, and she said that she had another century of poetry to write. So obviously, there wasn't enough time. So some projects are too time intense to be realized. Then some projects are too expensive, too big. It can also be that the project is too small to be realized. Silvio Meirelles always wanted to have a tiny little cube exhibited in a gigantic museum, and everything else would have to be empty in the museum. So it took him like 40 years to convince the museum to do that. That project was kind of too small to be realized. Then some projects, it's so many different possibilities why a project is unrealized. So it's also censorship, of course. Then there is also the possibility, of course, that's where art kind of meets sometimes architecture, of public art commissions. That sometimes artists are invited to a commission and then, it's not realized because the commissioner cannot do it, doesn't want to do it, it loses the competition. And then last but not least, Doris Lessing always told me that we shouldn't forget the projects which we want to do but don't dare to do, which are basically, she called them the self-censored projects. I always wanted to write a novel, but I think it's going to be terribly embarrassing, so I've never written a novel. So that will fall in this category. So yeah, to cut a long story short, I wanted to ask you to tell us maybe about 1, 2, or 3 of your favorite unrealized project, of 1 or 2 or 3 of operators' favorite unrealized projects.
So first, the reason this project wasn't realized, because it was realized up until the moment of fabrication and then COVID. And so that's why this project wasn't realized. So that's the reason. But we'll talk about the project. So the project concept was about boredom, about stillness, and if it had a tagline, it would probably be waiting for a train that never comes, is the feeling of the work. And so the project is called In Waiting, and it was commissioned by ADO not long after On View in 2019, and so in 2020 we started developing In Waiting. And this was interesting because it was a structure that you had to take a long walk to get to this, to the center of the structure. And it was focused on the idea of boredom and the importance of boredom, the importance of stillness, and how in our current digital architectures, boredom is something that is not very accessible to us. And we always have technology that is nagging us and pulling us away from the present moment. And so again, this theme of calm technology in our practice, something that we're interested in, the technology only being there when it's relevant, but otherwise going to the periphery. So we wanted to create an In Waiting, the experience of watching paint dry. So you had, maybe inspiration would come from within in that moment of watching paint dry. And the project didn't get realized because the ADO, as all the institutions, had to shut down and couldn't show work. But then, of course, as we all know, it was like, okay, maybe we'll be opening in 2 months. And so they were like, okay, can you rework the concept a little bit? Because everyone's been in confinement, and I don't think they're going to want to come take the subway and then arrive to In Waiting to watch paint dry.
They've just been trapped in their rooms, so they basically just did in Waiting at home. I don't think you want to invite people to be like, come sit by yourself in a room in our art institution. Like, didn't feel sensitive.
So, we were kind of heartbroken on that, but we're like, okay. So then we created a ruin of In Waiting, a literal ruin. So we exploded the architecture of the structure we built and built greenery around it, and created almost this idea of a site for experiential learning, looking back on the present, from the future. That was the idea. But then it got, that's a second one, 2-for-1 canceled projects, because then it just got canceled all the way because we know what happened. So those are 2 unrealized projects in one. And do you have another one?
I have a couple notes on that one.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So it was kind of the other tagline, if you will, was we used to have to carve out time to do something. Now we have to carve out time to do nothing. So almost it was like an artwork that was just like, here, come do nothing, you know, and it was inspired by the train platform, because that used to be a moment where, you know, you would be bored. Like, you would sit and you would wait for the train or the bus, and like, you're just there. You're looking at the street, you're looking at people around, and that used to be kind of an empty moment. And now those empty moments are obviously full. And so it was almost creating an artwork to create what was no longer there, which are like, you know, moments to do nothing and wait for the train, even though the train's never coming. But you got that nice empty moment, which is kind of luxurious. So that was that. Our other unrealized concept is we're really obsessed with bathing and thermal waters. And so for our anniversary every year, I'm basically just like looking all over the internet for interesting places for Dejha to like go in natural springs. And so,
Thank you.
And so an immersion, like if the definition of immersion is like to be fully enveloped in something. And so to think about being submerged in water, if you're an artist thinking about immersion, the feeling of being submerged in water is actually a very driving and interesting, rich feeling. This all brings me to, we have essentially an experiential artwork that is infrastructurally a spa, but it's art. But it's immersion and temperature and senses, and that's another unrealized one. It's too small to do.
Amazing. Very last question. Very often when I visit studios now, artists have kind of unrealized projects to make video games. Obviously, this year for the first time, more than 3 billion people worldwide play or engage with video games. That's more than a third of the world population. And more and more artists, of course, with the availability of game engines, you know, are developing their own games. It's also interesting in terms of blockchain technology that very often that kind of enters the gamification and enters the world of games. For example, you know, we realized this game with Gabriel Massan at the Serpentine, actually in collaboration with Tezos, where visitors can either watch people play the game or can play the game themselves, you know, in the exhibition. And then almost like, it's interesting because the NFT almost became a souvenir, which is kind of, I found a new dimension to the NFT because, you know, in the sort of analog world, one would sort of have a postcard as a souvenir of an exhibition. And here the visitors as a souvenir would actually for free, you know, get a Tezos minted NFT reflecting their own experience, how they played the game. Because obviously, you know, once they play the game, then the game starts again from scratch. So people could take home their kind of souvenir of the game. So in that sense, you know, the NFT became part of that sort of gaming experience. So I was kind of curious if you had any sort of unrealized projects maybe with games.
Just with our cat. I want to get more innovative with how I play with her. I started researching this. There's amazing innovation. Innovation's not happening in the tech world, it's happening in the cat furniture world, I swear. I found recently there's like companies that make cat bridges that you can like install in your ceiling so that your cat can like be on bridges and then like have perches so she feels like she's in the wild. So that's like the only games I'm really interested in right now.
I would say not video games as video medium games. I mean, games as in the structure of game theory and gameplay, I think is more interesting. And the idea for us, the idea of the spa, as well as another project which is basically a cocktail bar where the medium is conversation. And both of these, and experiential art for us, it has the aspect of game theory where you create the simple rule sets to develop emergent behavior and interactions. So not through the medium of video games, but the core principles of game theory, I think often apply to our experiential art practice.
That could not be a better conclusion. Thank you so much. Big round of applause for Operator. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here. And please give another big round of applause for Operator.